The plaza's grand ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged more to a film set than to a Saturday evening in October. Garlands of white orchids cascaded from the chandeliers, and the light caught every crystal drop at an angle that Nora Calloway had been chasing for the past 3 hours, shifting her position along the perimeter of the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that her job was to be invisible. She pressed her back against a marble column, adjusted the aperture on her camera, and watched the dance floor fill with Manhattan's most carefully dressed people. The bride was beautiful. The groom looked like a man counting down the minutes to a business meeting. Nora had photographed enough weddings to recognize the difference between a love match and a merger. This one was clearly the latter, and she felt the particular kind of sadness that came from witnessing something hollow, dressed up in $400,000 worth of flowers. She was lining up a shot of the centerpiece when she felt a hand close around her wrist. It was not rough, but it was not gentle either. It was the grip of someone accustomed to decisions being carried out without question, and before Nora could process what was happening, she had been turned, pulled forward, and a man she had never seen before in her life had his hand at the curve of her jaw and his mouth on hers. The kiss lasted approximately 4 seconds. It was controlled, deliberate, and performed with the calm precision of someone who had planned every element of it. When he pulled back, he did not look at her. He looked out at the room, at the faces turning toward them, the ripple of attention moving outward like a stone dropped in still water, and he said, just quietly enough that only she could hear, "I need you to smile, like you mean it." Just for the next 60 seconds. Nora did not smile. She looked at the side of his face, which was objectively the face of someone who had spent his entire life being told the world would rearrange itself for his convenience, and said, in a voice she kept very level, "You just kissed me in front of 400 people. I'm aware of that. I don't know you. You're about to." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were a very dark shade of gray, the kind of color that appeared in photographs of winter coastlines, and they were absolutely unreadable. "Damien Holt, and you are leaving." She stepped back, and his hand fell away from her jaw, and for one moment she thought she was actually going to walk out of this situation with her dignity intact. Then the murmuring reached her, not hostile, but loud and pointed and everywhere, and she became aware that the mother of the groom was crossing the room toward them with the expression of a woman who had just had her entire evening restructured without her permission. "Nora," he said her name. She stopped. "You don't know my name." "Nora Calloway. You've shot 3 weddings at this venue in the past year. You did the Whitmore Park event in April and the Delacroix rehearsal dinner in June." He said it without inflection, as though he were reciting facts about weather patterns, and the calmness of it made her feel something cold and deliberate in the air between them. "You're not a guest. You work here tonight, which means if this becomes a scene, your contract with the venue is at risk." The mother of the groom arrived. She was a woman of 60 or so, with hair the color of pale champagne and the smile of someone who had trained herself to never show what she actually thought. "Damien," she said, and the word carried the specific warmth of a hostess who was deciding in real time how to process a disruption. "We weren't aware you'd be bringing anyone this evening. Apologies, Margaret." His hand came to rest at Nora's back, light enough that she could have stepped away from it, but present enough that the entire ballroom read it as a statement. "Nora prefers to keep things quiet. I hope you'll forgive the surprise." Margaret looked at Nora with the kind of careful, sweeping assessment that wealthy women had perfected over generations. Whatever she found or decided to find, she let it settle into a gracious nod. "Of course. She's lovely." And then she moved away, and the murmuring adjusted itself, and the band, with the intuition of people paid to maintain atmospheres, shifted smoothly into a slower song. Nora did not move. Damien's hand was still at her back, and she was acutely aware of the number of people watching them with the specific interest of people who had just witnessed something they intended to discuss at dinner parties for months. "What just happened," she said quietly, "is not something I agreed to." "No," he said. "It isn't. That's why I'd like to explain." "You'd like to explain why you kissed a stranger in front of the entire room?" "Yes, as opposed to why you didn't simply ask." There was a pause. It was brief, but she caught at the first moment in which his composure adjusted by a fraction. "If I had asked, you would have said no." "Correct." "And I didn't have time for no." He guided her, with the lightest possible pressure at her back, toward the edge of the room, not dragging, not insisting, but managing the direction of their movement in a way that was deeply infuriating because it was so effortless. There's a hallway through those doors. I can explain in 2 minutes, and then you can decide whether to walk away. Fair? She looked at him steadily. He was tall, several inches above her, 5 to 6, and he was wearing a suit that had clearly been made for his specific measurements by someone who charged an amount she preferred not to think about. He did not look like a man who made impulsive decisions. He looked like a man who had weighed this one very carefully and simply arrived at a conclusion she hadn't been consulted on. 2 minutes, she said, and I'm keeping count. In the hallway, which was quiet and columned and smelled of flowers and old carpet, Damien Holt turned to face her with the air of a man accustomed to boardrooms and not, particularly, to consequences. The woman Margaret was about to introduce me to tonight, he said, is the daughter of a business associate my family has been working with for 3 years. There is an understanding between our families that the relationship would become something more formal. He paused. I have no interest in that. I've communicated that clearly, repeatedly, and in writing. Tonight was apparently meant to be the occasion that changed my mind. Nora looked at him. So you kissed the first woman you could reach. You were the only person in that room who was clearly not a guest, which meant you had no social stake in what happened next. He stopped. And again there was that fractional adjustment. You were standing apart from everyone. You looked like you knew exactly what you were doing. I made a judgment call. You made a judgment call that involved my face. Yes. He met her eyes without flinching. And I am prepared to compensate you for it. What I am proposing is simple. 3 appearances. 2 weeks. You attend 2 more events as my guest. We are photographed together, and the narrative takes hold long enough for this particular arrangement to be dissolved quietly. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, which he held out between 2 fingers. The number on the back is what I'm offering. If it's insufficient, tell me what would be. Nora took the card. She looked at the number on the back. She looked at him. This is a lot of money, she said. Yes, for someone to come to parties with you, among other things. You'd be required to be convincing and discreet. She turned the card over. The front was simple. Damien Holt, Holt Industries, and a New York address. No title. People who needed titles on their cards, she'd once been told, were people who weren't sure enough of themselves to let the name do the work. She placed the card against her palm and thought of her studio lease, which was due in 3 weeks, and her camera body, which had been threatening to give out for 2 months, and the very specific, a very familiar feeling of counting out what was left in her account after expenses and finding a number that made her chest tight. I have conditions, she said. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but recalibration. All right. You don't make decisions about my body again without asking first. No contact without warning. No information about me given to anyone without my approval. And I want half, up front, transferred before the second event. He studied her for a moment. Done. She should have felt the shape of the agreement, the way it fit too cleanly, the way he'd agreed too fast. She was good at reading rooms. She had spent years learning to see what was happening beneath the surface of things, the bride who was holding it together, the family member trying not to cry, the groom looking at someone who wasn't his bride. She was good at noticing. She did not notice, in that hallway, the specific tension that crossed Damien Holt's face when she reached up to tuck her hair back, and the old gold ring on her right hand caught the light. It was her mother's ring. She'd worn it since the funeral, 3 years ago. It was plain, without markings, and she'd never thought to ask where it came from. Damien looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked away. Across the ballroom, visible through the glass panels of the corridor doors, a woman stood near the bar in a midnight blue gown. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair swept elegantly back, and a posture that spoke of decades of authority. She was watching the corridor with an expression that was not anger, and was not curiosity. It was the expression of someone recognizing something they had hoped, for a very long time, not to see. Diana Holt lifted her glass, and did not drink from it. The car that arrived the following morning to collect Nora's bags was a black Escalade, with tinted windows, and a driver who introduced himself as Marcus, and did not appear to require conversation, which suited her. She sat in the back with her camera bag on her lap, and watched Midtown give way to the Upper East Side, the streets narrowing into something older and more deliberate, and tried to settle the particular discomfort of a decision she had made with her eyes open, and was only now beginning to feel the full weight of. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a building on East 73rd, 2 blocks from the park. It was not Damien's apartment, he'd been clear about that, but it was clearly adjacent to his world in every way that mattered. The kitchen had a brand of espresso machine that cost more than her previous month's rent. The closet in the second bedroom contained, inexplicably, a selection of clothing in her size, which she discovered when she opened it and stood looking at it for a long moment, before closing it again and deciding to unpack her own things first. There was a note on the kitchen counter, handwritten on cream paper, which said, "Event Thursday, 7 p.m. Black tie. Details to follow. D.H. No greeting. No pleasantry." She propped it against the espresso machine and made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the window that looked out over the roofline of the building across the street, where a water tower stood against an October sky, the color of brushed steel, and thought, carefully, about what she had agreed to. The Thursday event was a Holt Industries gala at a venue in Tribeca, a converted warehouse space that had been dressed up into something that felt simultaneously industrial and absurdly expensive. Exposed brick behind arrangements of white flowers that must have required an entire greenhouse to produce. Nora arrived in a car that appeared without being called, wearing a dress from the closet she had initially decided not to touch, because when she'd looked at her own wardrobe for something that said, "I belong in this room," she'd arrived at the honest conclusion that she owned nothing, that said that Damien was waiting near the entrance, and the first thing she noticed was that he was looking at his phone, which meant she had approximately 3 seconds to observe him without being observed back, and she used them the way she used every 3 seconds in a room cataloging. He was more relaxed in his own space than he had been in that corridor at the plaza. The suit was different tonight, darker, and he wore it with the ease of someone who had stopped noticing clothes years ago. When he looked up and saw her, his expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, the way a frame does when the picture inside it finally fits. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say things." "I'm not people," she said, and walked past him into the room. The evening moved, the way these evenings always moved, with the polished, frictionless momentum of events where everyone present was performing some version of themselves for everyone else. Nora kept her hand loosely in the crook of Damien's arm, which was what they had agreed upon, and she watched the room with the part of her brain that never fully stopped working, the part that composed frames and read light and noticed things. She noticed the way Damien was greeted with respect that had a particular edge to it, the kind that came from people who were slightly afraid of you. She noticed the way he spoke to people, economical and precise, never wasting a sentence, never asking a question he didn't already know the answer to. She noticed, midway through the evening, that he was watching her in return, not constantly, not obviously, but at intervals, the way you watched something you were still assessing. "You're doing it again," she said, when they paused near the bar while a conversation reshuffled itself around them. "Doing what?" "Cataloging me." He looked at her without expression. "I don't know what that means." "Yes, you do." She kept her voice light. "You've been doing it all evening. I do it too, in rooms, watching to see what people actually are beneath what they're presenting." There was a pause. "And what have you concluded?" "About you?" She tilted her head slightly. "That you make decisions you're comfortable with and then stop questioning them. That you're very good at rooms but you don't enjoy them. That you're more careful than you appear, which is saying something, because you appear extremely careful." She paused. "That whatever made you grab a stranger at that wedding was not as impulsive as it looked." He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. "You're perceptive. It's my job. What do you see when you look at me?" He seemed to consider this with genuine thought rather than deflection, which she hadn't expected. "Someone who is very good at being present without being visible," he said, finally. "Someone who is used to providing a service and leaving before anyone notices she was there." His gaze moved briefly to her right hand, where the old ring caught the light from a cluster of candles on the bar. "Someone who is wearing something that doesn't belong to her world." Her fingers closed slightly. Instinctively. "The dress is from your closet." "I meant the ring." She looked at him. He looked back. And whatever he'd just said, he wasn't going to say more. And she could see that very clearly, the door closing. Smooth, and without drama. She chose not to push it. She turned back toward the room. and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment, which was its own kind of surprise. It was during that silence that she became aware of a woman nearby, the same silver-haired woman from the plaza, closer now, near enough for Nora to see her face clearly. Diana Holt. She'd done enough research by then to know the name. Damien's father's sister, the woman who had held the operational structure of Holt Industries together through 2 crises and 1 hostile takeover attempt in the mid-2000s, and who was still, by most accounts, the person whose approval mattered most internally. Diana was speaking with another guest, smiling, but her eyes had tracked to Nora with a frequency that Nora had noticed twice already this evening. Not the idle curiosity of someone wondering who the CEO's new companion was. Something with more attention behind it. "Your aunt," Nora said quietly. Damien followed her eyeline. "She's been watching you," he said, which was not a denial. "I noticed." She kept her voice neutral. "Should I be concerned about that?" "No," but he said it a beat too quickly, and she caught at the first gap in the wall of his composure. Small enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been paying the kind of attention she paid to everything. She filed it away without comment. 3 days later, she was walking back from a coffee run through the park. One of the small daily rituals she'd established to give herself something that felt like hers in an otherwise alien landscape when the photographer appeared. He was not subtle about it. Camera with a long lens, positioned across the street from the building entrance, and she recognized the posture of someone on assignment. She didn't break stride. She went inside, took the elevator up, and sat down at the kitchen window with her coffee, and thought about who would be interested in photographs of her in this particular neighborhood, and why, and who might have told them where to be. The answer she arrived at was not comforting. That evening, she texted the number Damien had given her. "Someone's been following me." Photographer, not press. He didn't approach. No questions, just documentation. "Who knows I'm here?" The response came in under 2 minutes. "How long ago?" 3 hours. "I'll handle it. Don't open the door for anyone tonight." She stared at the message. Then she typed, "That's not an answer to my question." A longer pause this time. Then, "We can talk tomorrow." She set the phone down and looked out at the city, which was doing what it always did at this hour, arranging itself in lights and motion against a sky that never fully darkened, and she felt, for the first time since she'd agreed to this, the specific sensation of standing in a room where the door you came in through was no longer visible. The ring on her hand caught the light from the window, and she turned it once on her finger, the way she had done since she was 22, which was when her mother had slipped it onto her hand and said, "Hold on to this, Nora. It matters more than either of us knows," and then had said nothing more about it, and died the following year before Nora could ask again. The Holt Industries Foundation Gala was the kind of event that required a full week of editorial planning in New York's social diary, just to account for who would be seated next to whom, and Nora arrived at it feeling, for the first time since the plaza, genuinely out of her depth. The venue was the rooftop of a building in the meatpacking district, enclosed for the season in glass that turned the Manhattan skyline into a panoramic backdrop, and the guest list read like a catalog of every person with significant financial stake in the cultural and economic architecture of the city. Damien moved through it with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this since childhood, which he had, and Nora stayed close enough to be convincing, while maintaining the internal distance she'd learned to keep in spaces like this, present but unattached, visible enough to perform the role, contained enough not to lose herself in it. She was managing this successfully until she found herself, during a 10-minute window, when Damien had been separated from her by a cluster of board members who needed 30 seconds each of his time, standing near the edge of the room, beside a man of perhaps 70 who introduced himself as Gerald Marsh. "Foundation Counsel," he said, with the warmth of someone who had spent decades making people comfortable before delivering complex information. 30 years with Holt Industries. "You must be Nora." "I am," she said, with the measured smile she had been practicing. "I have to say." He paused, and something crossed his face, a flicker of something that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. He was looking at her with a specificity that she'd learned to notice. Not the way men looked at women at parties, and not the way people looked at someone new in their social circle. It was the look of someone encountering a detail that shouldn't be where it was. "You remind me of someone," he said finally, in a tone that was trying very hard to stay casual and not entirely succeeding. "I get that a lot," she said, which was not true. "Yes. Well," he cleared his throat. You both seem very well suited." He was looking at her right hand, at the ring, and his expression had done something she couldn't name, a compression, like a man swallowing a sentence he'd just decided not to say. "Forgive me. I don't mean to star. It's just that ring, quite distinctive." Nora looked down at it. "It was my mother's." "Yes." The word came out too quickly, too softly, and then he recovered. "Yes, of course. A lovely piece." He touched his glass. "I should find the Harrington table." "It was a pleasure, Ms. Calloway." He walked away, and Nora stood looking after him, and the feeling that had been quietly gathering at the edges of her awareness for days became, in that moment, something more definite. She turned the ring on her finger. She was still standing there when Damien reappeared at her elbow. "You look like you've seen something you weren't expecting," he said. "Gerald Marsh." A pause. The kind that confirmed he knew exactly who that was. "What about him?" "He recognized something about me. Or thought he did." She kept her voice even. "He reacted to this ring." Damien's expression did not change, but she had been watching him long enough now to read the very small vocabulary of adjustments he made when he was deciding what not to say. She saw one of those adjustments now, minute and controlled and absolutely present. "Gerald is sentimental," Damien said. "He's been with the company for decades. He reacts to many things." "Damien." She turned to face him squarely. "Is there something about me you know that you haven't told me?" He held her gaze. It was a very steady gaze, the kind that required practice to maintain when the honest answer was yes, and she could see him on the other side of it, behind the composure, making a choice. "The point of tonight," he said carefully, "is to appear settled and established in front of the board, not to create new conversations. That is an answer to a different question. Nora, I'm not asking you to confess anything," she said, and she kept her voice quiet and controlled and meant it. "I'm asking you to tell me if there's something I should know, because I walked into an agreement without all the information, and I'm starting to think that wasn't an accident." He looked at her for a long moment. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind him, all that lit glass and vertical ambition, and he stood against it with the specific stillness of a man who controlled large things and was currently being asked to release control of something small. "You're safe," he said finally. "That's what you need to know." It was not the answer she'd asked for, but she could see, very clearly, that it was the only one she was going to get tonight. She turned back to the room. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and she took a glass she didn't intend to drink, and across the room she could see Diana Holt watching the two of them, with the expression she now recognized, not hostility, not curiosity, but the focused, quiet vigilance of someone who was tracking a variable. The following morning, she was walking back from the corner cafe when she felt the paper in her coat pocket, the pocket she never used, pressed flat against the lining. She stopped on the sidewalk and pulled it out. It was a business card, cream, with the logo of a law firm, Marsh, Calloway and Associates, and on the back, in neat handwriting, "When you're ready, the ring is the key. No signature. No date." She stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and read it twice. Then she looked at her right hand. Then she kept walking. And she did not tell Damien about the card. Not that day, and not the day after. Because something in her was still deciding whether she was ready to open whatever door it was offering. And she understood, in the way you understand things about yourself that you have spent years avoiding, that she was afraid of what was on the other side. That evening, Damien came to the apartment the first time he had done so, and he arrived without the composure she'd come to read as his natural state. He was not disheveled, nothing as dramatic as that, but there was a quality to him that she recognized as controlled urgency. "Diana had someone investigating you," he said. He did not sit down. "I confirmed it this morning. I've stopped it." She looked at him from across the kitchen. "For how long has she been investigating me?" "Since the first night." He said it without softening. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He moved to the window, the same window she sat at most mornings, and looked out at the water tower and the steel-colored sky. "She's protective of the company, of the family. You're a variable she can't account for. Why can't she account for me?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched just past comfortable. "Because I can't fully account for you either." he said finally. And it was different from his other answers, not a calculation, but something that had come from a different place in him entirely, and she could hear the difference. And she thought he could too, because he turned from the window almost immediately, as though he'd said it by accident. She wanted to press on it. She wanted to ask what he meant, and why, and what it was that he had decided about her from the beginning that had made him choose her specifically from a room full of people. She opened her mouth. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a number she didn't recognize, and she picked it up by reflex. And the woman on the other end said she was calling from Marsh, Calloway and Associates, and that Gerald Marsh had requested the call, and that he would very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with her at her convenience. She looked up at Damien. He was watching her. "I need to take this," she said. He nodded once and moved toward the door, and she thought she saw something in his expression, a recognition, a bracing, the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular event and has now watched it begin. The offices of Marsh, Calloway and Associates were on the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue, and they had the particular aesthetic of an institution that had been doing the same kind of careful, consequential work for a very long time: dark wood, natural light, and the specific quietness of a place where people came to learn things that changed the shape of their lives. Gerald Marsh was already seated when she arrived, a thin folder on the table before him, his hands folded on top of it with the stillness of a man who had been rehearsing this moment. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Thank you for coming." She sat down across from him and placed her hands in her lap. The ring turned inward against her palm, a habit she'd developed without noticing it. "You said the ring was a key." "Yes." He touched the folder. "Your mother's name was Susan Calloway, née Hargrove. She grew up in Savannah, moved to New York in her mid-20s, and worked as a research analyst at Holt Industries for 4 years. He paused. During that time, she was in a relationship with Franklin Calloway, no relation by blood. He took the name professionally, who was the co-founder and second largest shareholder of the company. The room was very quiet. The traffic sounds from 31 floors below were a murmur, barely present. "Franklin died 11 years ago," Gerald continued. "Heart failure at 57. He was not survived by his wife. She had predeceased him. He was survived by one biological child." He opened the folder and turned it toward her. "That child is you, Miss Calloway. Your mother signed a confidentiality agreement 6 months before your birth. Franklin funded your upbringing through a blind trust, and never, to his significant regret, found a way around the agreement he had made with the Holt family." She looked at the documents in the folder. Her mother's signature, neat and familiar, on paper that was 30 years old. Her own name, handwritten in the margins of a founding charter she had never known existed. And the ring, there it was, in an inventory of Franklin Calloway's personal effects, listed with a brief description. "Gold band, plain, given to S. Hargrove, as promise of acknowledgement, to be returned to their child as proof of lineage." She sat with this for a long moment. "How much?" she said finally, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "Does 30% of Holt Industries represent?" "At current valuation, somewhere in the range of $400 million. Gerald's voice was careful, gentle, the voice of a man who had delivered large truths to people who weren't prepared for them, and had learned to stay very still while they landed. "This is not a gift, Miss Calloway. It is what your father intended you to have. He spent the last years of his life building a legal framework to ensure that if you ever came forward, the claim would be airtight." She stood up slowly, not because she had somewhere to go, but because sitting felt impossible. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the specific stretch of Park Avenue that cut through the center of it, all that ordered, vertical ambition, and felt something very strange, not triumph, not devastation, but the particular vertigo of a person who has just found out that the ground they have been standing on their entire life was a different thing than they believed. Her father had been real. He had known about her. He had tried. She turned the ring on her finger. "It matters more than either of us knows." She called Damien from the lobby, and he answered on the first ring, and she said, "I'm coming to the building," and he said, "I know," and the "I know" landed in a specific way. Not the "I know" of a man who had tracked her movement, but the "I know" of a man who had been waiting for this call. She arrived at Holt Industries' Midtown Tower and was shown to the 40th floor without being asked for identification, which was its own answer. The receptionist used her name. The elevator opened onto a corridor where an assistant looked up and said, "He's expecting you," and pointed her toward a conference room where, it turned out, Damien Holt was not alone. Diana was there, and 4 members of what she would later understand to be the board of directors, and a lawyer she didn't recognize, and a presentation that appeared to have been assembled in advance, which meant it had been assembled before this morning's conversation at Marsh, Calloway and Associates, which meant, "Please sit down," Diana said. Nora looked around the room. Damien was at the far end of the table, and his face was a thing she could not fully read, not because he was hiding, she thought, but because he was feeling something he had not prepared a face for. "We'd like to discuss your relationship with my nephew," Diana said, and the context in which it began. "All right," Nora said, and sat. What followed was 40 minutes of careful, methodical dismantling. Diana laid out, with the precision of someone who had been building a case, a narrative. Nora Calloway, a woman of no particular resources, had positioned herself strategically at the wedding, in the agreement, in the apartment, with awareness of the Franklin Calloway estate claim. The documents Diana produced showed that Nora's mother had made several inquiries through intermediaries in the years before her death, that Nora herself had visited the Holt Industries website repeatedly in the months prior to the wedding, that her presence at the plaza had been Diana's word arranged. It was meticulously constructed. It was also, Nora recognized with a cold clarity, not entirely false on the factual level, which was what made it so effective. Her mother had made inquiries. She had visited the website she'd been researching the venue's corporate partners before the shoot. None of the individual facts were invented. The architecture they'd been arranged into, however, was a complete lie. She looked at Damien. He was looking at the table. "I want to ask you something," she said, and she directed it at him, and the room adjusted its attention. "Did you know who I was when you kissed me at the plaza?" The room went very quiet. Damien looked up. He held her gaze, and she saw it, the answer, before he said anything, in the specific quality of how he looked at her, which was the look of a man who was holding something heavy, and had been holding it long enough that the effort had become part of his posture. "Yes," he said. One word. The room absorbed it. "You knew who my father was," she said. "Yes." "You knew about the estate claim." "Yes." She nodded slowly. It did not feel the way she might have expected it to feel. It felt like the last piece of a puzzle, not satisfying, exactly, but clarifying. The shape of the thing she'd been sensing since that first hallway conversation, finally complete. "Then," she said, and she kept her voice very even, "what was the agreement actually for?" He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to understand who you were before the claim surfaced. Whether you knew, whether you were." He stopped. "Whether you were what my family was afraid of." And he looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw, beneath all of it, the man who had said, "I can't fully account for you either," at a rooftop party, the man who had shown up to the apartment with controlled urgency and said you should have been told sooner, the man who existed somewhere behind the composure, and who was currently costing himself something significant by saying what he was saying. "No," he said quietly. "You weren't," Diana said very sharply. "This doesn't change the legal picture." "The claim—" "I'm aware of the claim," Nora said. She looked at Diana directly for the first time. "I've just come from Gerald Marsh's office. I know what the documents say. I know what I'm entitled to." She paused. "I also know that you spent years protecting this company from exactly this kind of disruption, that you gave up things to do it." She watched Diana's expression, which shifted in a way she hadn't expected, not harder, but for 1/2 second, fractionally raw. "I understand why you're afraid of me." Diana said nothing. "I'd like 24 hours, Nora said, "before anything is filed or announced or litigated. I'd like to think." No one in the room objected. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked to the door. She did not look at Damien again. If she had, she was not certain she could have walked out without saying something she wasn't ready to say. And she needed to be the one who decided what happened next, and she needed to do that without his face in her line of sight. She pressed the elevator button and waited, and when the doors opened, she stepped inside, and the doors closed behind her, and for 37 floors she stood very still, looking at her reflection in the mirrored interior, and said nothing at all. She spent the night in the apartment on East 73rd with her coat on, sitting in the window that looked out over the water tower, the ring warm against her palm, and she thought about her mother. Not the version of her mother she'd been given, the woman who had carried a quiet sadness that Nora had always attributed to loneliness, to the absence of a man she'd loved who hadn't stayed, the ordinary grief of ordinary things. She thought instead about the version she was only now beginning to understand, the woman who had signed papers to keep her daughter's existence small and safe and free of a world that could have swallowed her whole. The woman who had kept a ring and told her it mattered. The woman who had, in her last years, made inquiries through intermediaries not for herself, Nora thought, but to know what would be waiting for her daughter if she ever chose to look. She thought about Franklin Calloway, who was a name in a document and a ring on her hand and nothing else, and would remain nothing else. And she let herself feel that for a while without trying to resolve it. By 3 in the morning, she had made her decision. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and Nora arrived at 9:45, which was early enough that the assistant outside the conference room looked surprised to see her. She asked to go in, and the assistant checked with someone, and then opened the door, and the 7 people already assembled inside looked up at her with varying degrees of composure. Diana, at the head of the table, went very still. Damien was not there. She noticed this without dwelling on it, and sat down, and folded her hands on the table, and looked at Diana. "I'd like to say something before the meeting formally begins," Nora said. "And I'd like to say it to you directly." Diana's expression was controlled to a degree that had cost her something. "Oh, right. What you built here matters," Nora said. "I've done enough research in the past 24 hours to understand what this company looked like in 2004, and what it looked like in 2009, and what it would have looked like without you. You gave up things that most people don't give up for institutions, and you did it for something you believed in." She paused. "I'm not here to take that away from you." Diana's chin lifted by a fraction. "I'm here to formally decline any claim to the Franklin Calloway estate share." Nora set a single document on the table, 1 page, signed at the bottom, which Gerald Marsh had drafted that morning at 6:45 a.m. when she'd called him, and which he had emailed to her as a PDF by 8, no questions asked. "I don't want the shares. I don't want the legal battle. I don't want to spend the next several years in a process that consumes both of us for something that won't actually give me what I lost." She kept her voice steady. "My father died before I knew he existed. That's not a wound that $400 million addresses. And taking it in a way that dismantles what he helped build would be a strange way to honor someone who apparently spent his last years trying to build something worth leaving." The room was very quiet. "You're giving it up," one of the board members said. He was a man of 60, and he sounded genuinely uncertain whether he had heard correctly. "I'm choosing not to pursue it." "Yes." Diana looked at the document. Something was moving across her face, complex and unresolved. The face of a woman who had spent 40 years defending a position and had just been told that the opponent had put down their weapon. It was not relief, exactly. It was the specific disorientation of someone whose response had been prepared for a different event. She reached for the document and looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, and with an effort that Nora could hear plainly, "Why?" "Because I'm not what you were afraid of," Nora said. "I was never what you were afraid of." Diana looked at her, and Nora saw it the half-second that cracked the surface. 60-something years of composure, and beneath it, a woman who had also lost things she couldn't name, and who had protected against that loss by protecting the only thing she'd been allowed to care about, at scale. She was not a villain. She was a person who had made herself into a wall, because walls don't get hurt. "I owe you an apology," Diana said, and the words came out carefully, like she was testing the weight of each one, not sure any of them would hold. "For the investigation." For she stopped. "For assuming." "I know," Nora said. "It's all right." "It isn't," Diana said, "but I will try to make it less not all right over time." She set the document down. "That's the best I can offer at present." "That's enough," Nora said. She left the building through the lobby and stepped out onto 5th Avenue, and the October air was sharper than she'd expected, carrying the particular energy of a city that would keep moving regardless of what had just happened on the 40th floor, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the middle of all of it and tried to locate herself in it. She had made the right decision. She knew that. It sat in her chest as something clean and certain, the kind of clarity that comes not from having everything resolved, but from having acted in line with who you actually are. She had chosen not to fight for something she didn't need in order to be herself. She was halfway to the corner when she heard her name. She stopped, turned. Damien was coming toward her from the building entrance, no jacket, which in 40-degree weather was the specific evidence of a man who had left a room faster than he'd planned to, and he was not moving with his usual controlled pace. He was moving with the particular urgency of someone who had been watching a window close and had finally decided the cost of not reaching it was higher than the cost of running. He stopped a foot away from her. They were on a public sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, and people were moving around them in the brisk, particular manner of New York pedestrians who had seen everything and would not be slowing down for any of it. "You were in there," she said. "I arrived late. Diana's assistant." He stopped. "I heard most of it." She waited. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. What you're giving up is not mine," she said. "Not in any way that matters. It's paper. It's leverage. It's not what I lost, and it won't get it back." She looked at him. He looked like a man who had prepared for many outcomes and had not fully prepared for this one. "Why weren't you there at the start?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was in Gerald Marsh's office." She blinked. "I went to give him documentation," Damien said. "Everything I had. My knowledge of your identity, the timeline, the agreement. I wanted it on record that you had not pursued the claim that you had come to this city without knowledge of who you were. That anything that happened between us was not calculated on your part." He paused. "I wanted the record to reflect the truth, even if I was the one who had." He stopped again, and she could see him looking for the right word, and finding, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that the right word was also the honest one. "Even if I was the one who had been calculating from the beginning. You were protecting the company," she said. "Initially," he held her gaze, "and then I wasn't." The traffic moved around them. A woman with a stroller navigated past. A delivery bike rang its bell. The city continued at full pace. "Damien," she said, "I need you to say the whole thing." He looked at her, and the composure was still there. It would probably always be there, she thought. It was built into the architecture of him, but it was also thinner than it had ever been, and she could see him on the other side of it more clearly than she'd seen anything in a long time. "I knew who you were before I kissed you," he said. "I chose you from that room deliberately, because I thought if I could contain the situation, I could manage the outcome. Keep the estate claim quiet until I had assessed the threat. Control every variable." He paused. "And then I spent 2 weeks talking to you, and watching you, and listening to you in rooms. And the thing I had not accounted for was that you would be, don't say remarkable," she said. "Please. Real," he said. "That you would be real. That I would look at you and stop thinking about variables." She was quiet for a moment. The cold was genuine now, pressing in at the edges. She watched his face, which was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. It was simply there, unmanaged, without strategy, and it was more arresting than anything she'd seen in 2 weeks of watching him in rooms. "I'm angry at you," she said. "I want you to know that clearly, what you did at the beginning, using me, using what you knew that was wrong. It's going to take time. I know, and I don't know yet what time looks like between us. I don't have a picture of it." "Neither do I," he said. And then, very quietly, almost as though he hadn't intended to say it out loud, "That's new." She looked at him for a long moment. The ring was warm against her finger. The city moved and moved around them, indifferent and endless. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "of going back to Savannah, to where my mother grew up. I thought I might take photographs there." She paused. "There are things I want to understand about her, about him, about where I come from." "That makes sense," he said. "I don't know how long I'll be gone." "I know. You're not going to ask to come." He looked at her steadily. "No, you need to go do that." His jaw shifted slightly, the smallest muscular movement, the thing he did when he was holding something. "But I would like," he stopped. "Tried again. I would like there to be a version of this where you come back." She looked at him for a long time, at the controlled, careful, imperfectly honest person in front of her, who had started something he hadn't expected to feel, and who was standing on a sidewalk in 40-degree weather without a jacket, which was as close to defenseless as she suspected he had ever voluntarily been. "I'll think about it," she said. And then, because she was honest, because she had always been honest, it was one of the few things she was certain about herself, she said, "I'm already thinking about it." Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile, exactly, but it was the precursor to one, and she thought it was probably rare. And she was glad she had her photographer's eye, the part of her that never stopped seeing, because she would want to remember exactly what it looked like. She turned and walked toward the corner, and she did not look back, because she didn't need to. She knew he was still there. She could feel the weight of it, the particular feeling of someone watching you go, not because they wanted you to stay, but because they were already thinking about what came next. The light changed. She crossed the street. The city closed around her, familiar and enormous, full of things she had not yet seen. The ring was warm against her palm. She was ready. She walked back into the ballroom with her camera raised, and for the next 2 hours she did what she had been hired to do, which was to find the true moments inside the performed ones. The grandmother who wiped her eye during the first dance and thought no one was watching. The small boy in a miniature suit who fell asleep under a table during dessert. The bride, in a single unguarded second between the cake cutting and the bouquet, looking out the window at the New York skyline, with an expression that was not quite happy and not quite sad, but something in between that Nora did not have a name for. She photographed all of it, and she thought about the card in her jacket pocket, and she thought about the number on the back of it, and she thought about her mother, who had told her, very specifically, on the morning she left for college, with 2 suitcases and a used camera body she'd saved for over 6 months, that the most dangerous thing in the world was a room full of powerful people who had already decided what you were. She had not understood what her mother meant at the time. She was beginning to understand it now. At 11:15, she collected her equipment bag and her jacket and took the service elevator to the lobby, which was the route she always used when she was done for the evening, because it avoided the front entrance and the particular exhaustion of navigating farewell conversations with hosts who needed to feel that the event had been everything they'd planned. She was crossing the marble lobby when her phone buzzed with a transfer notification. Half the amount from the card, exactly, arrived in her account at 11:17 p.m. on a Saturday. Because Damien Holt was apparently a man who did not wait until Monday. She stopped in the lobby and looked at her phone. And then she looked at the lobby, the plaza lobby, with its enormous flower arrangements and its history and its very specific smell of money and occasion, and she thought, this is already a different kind of situation than any I have been in before. She thought it with the cool, clear attention of someone who had learned to see things accurately. Not fear, not excitement, just recognition. The recognition of a person who had just stepped into a current and was deciding, in real time, how strong a swimmer she was. She walked out onto Central Park South and hailed a cab, and the city received her the way it always did, without sentimentality, without ceremony, and she rode back to her studio apartment in Astoria and sat on her bed with her camera bag on the floor beside her and the number in her bank account on her phone screen, and she did not sleep for a very long time. In the morning, the first text arrived from the number on the card. Thursday event is a board dinner. Tribeca. I'll send the details by Monday. D. She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed back. Noted. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, are you always this brief? She considered the question. Then, are you? A pause that lasted long enough that she put her phone down and made coffee. When she picked it up again. Fair. She looked at the word on her screen. 1 syllable. A man who used the minimum possible number of words to acknowledge being understood, and chose that one not yes or fine or good point, but fair, which was a word about equity, about acknowledgement, about the specific admission that the other person had scored a point worth noting. She filed it away. She was building a vocabulary of him. She did it with everyone she photographed. This process of accumulation, the small details that added up to a person, the gestures and hesitations and word choices that told the truth beneath the presentation. With most people, she filed it away and forgot it once the job was done. She had a feeling she was not going to forget this one. Across the city, in an office that occupied the corner of the 40th floor of a building on Park Avenue, Damien Holt sat in front of his computer at 7:42 in the morning and looked at a photograph. It was a publicly available image, her portfolio website, the About page, a professional headshot taken in what appeared to be natural light, the kind of light that photographers knew how to find in any space. She was looking at the camera with the expression of someone who had decided, consciously, that they were going to be present for this photograph rather than managed by it. He looked at it for a while. Then he closed the window and went back to his email. He did not look at the ring she'd been wearing in the photograph, although he had noticed it. In fact, the moment he first saw her across the ballroom, before he'd crossed to her, before he'd made any decision about what to do next. He had noticed it, and recognized it, and felt the specific sensation of a variable arriving from a direction he had not anticipated. He had spent 3 days after that confirmation deciding what to do, and then he had kissed her in front of 400 people, because sometimes the only way to buy time was to make the move everyone was already watching for. He had not planned to talk to her the way he had in that hallway. He had planned to be brief and efficient and contractual. He had not planned the 2 minutes to stretch into 12, and he had not planned to notice the way she listened, not for gaps in what he was saying, not for angles she could use, but with the specific attention of someone who was actually trying to understand. He had not planned any of what came after. He opened a new email and began typing, and he did not think about the ring, and he did not think about the way she had stood in the lobby of the plaza, looking at her phone with an expression that was, in the fraction of a second, he'd seen it from across the lobby on his way to the parking garage, entirely unguarded. He was very good at not thinking about things. What she did not expect, in the days between the Thursday gala and the next event, was the quiet. She had anticipated that the arrangement would feel transactional in the way that most arrangements felt, two people circling each other with the specific wariness of those who have agreed to something but are still measuring what it will cost. She had expected to feel the edges of it at all times, the contractual border between what was real and what was performed. Instead, she found herself, on a Tuesday morning, sitting on the floor of the living room of the apartment on East 73rd, with the contents of her mother's old shoebox spread around her, photographs, letters, small objects she had carried from apartment to apartment since the funeral, without ever being fully ready to go through them, while the October light came through the windows at an angle that she might have described, in a different context, as cinematic. She didn't know why she'd brought the shoebox. She hadn't packed it deliberately. She'd been in a hurry on moving day, and she'd taken the box from under her bed because it was one of the things she couldn't leave behind. And now it was here, and she was here, and she had 3 days before the next event, and she had nothing to do in this apartment that wasn't hers, in this life that wasn't hers either. And so she opened the box and looked at her mother. There were photographs from before Nora, her mother at 22 or 23, in what looked like a rooftop party. The skyline in the background was clearly New York, and she was laughing at someone off camera, and she was wearing a white dress, and looked like someone who had not yet learned to be careful. There were photographs from Savannah, the city her mother had grown up in, before the move north. There was a letter from her mother's mother that Nora read twice without understanding all of it, but that contained, buried in the 4th paragraph, the sentence, "I know you think New York will give you something Savannah didn't, but be careful what you go looking for, Susan. Some things find you back." She held the letter for a long time. Then she found the photograph at the bottom of the box. It was small, slightly blurred, taken on a camera that had not been sophisticated, and it showed her mother standing beside a man Nora had never seen before, a man of perhaps 35, with dark hair and the particular posture of someone who had earned their confidence rather than inherited it, and who was looking at her mother with an expression so direct and so specific that even in a slightly blurred photograph taken decades ago, it was unmistakable. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, "Franklin, April, Manhattan." She sat very still for a long time. Then she put everything back in the box, and put the box back in the closet, and went to wash her face, and stood at the bathroom mirror, looking at herself, at the line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, the particular way her expressions moved across her face, and tried to see what Gerald Marsh had seen across a gala room, what had made him stop and go still. She wasn't sure she could see it. She had been looking at her own face her whole life, and she had seen only her mother. Maybe that was what you saw when you were inside something. The angle was wrong. She dried her face and went back to the window and thought about the man in the photograph, and the city outside, and all the things that had been in this city all along, waiting for her to know they were here. The Thursday event passed into a Friday that brought rain and a text from Damien, not about the arrangement, not logistics or scheduling, just, "There's a gallery opening in Chelsea tonight. The photographer is someone you'd recognize. If you want to go separately, no obligation." She stared at the text for a while. It was not a natural text for a man executing a contract. It was the text of a person who had thought, This is a thing she might want, and then sent it, and then probably thought about whether sending it had been a miscalculation. She typed back, "Who is the photographer?" He told her. She looked up the gallery. She looked at the rain outside. "I'll meet you there at 7, she typed. She was 3 minutes early. He was already there, standing near the entrance with no umbrella, his jacket dark with rain at the shoulders, looking at a large format print on the near wall, with the focused, quiet attention of someone who had cleared his mind to look at something. She stood beside him and looked at the print, a landscape, enormous, color-saturated, of a desert highway at dusk, and they were both quiet for a while. "You actually like photography," she said finally. "Yes, not just as a concept. The real things," he said, "are always easier than the concepts." He paused, looking at the print. "This is real." She thought about that. "What about people?" she said. "Are people easier as concepts or as real things?" He was quiet for a moment. "Concepts are safer," he said. "Real things are." He paused. "More expensive." She turned that over in her mind. He meant costly, emotionally, practically, in some way that the word expensive was standing in for because he didn't have another word handy. She understood that. She had her own vocabulary of approximations for things she didn't have exact words for. They moved through the gallery slowly, and they talked about photography, about light and framing and what it meant to capture a thing rather than simply document it. And it was the first conversation she'd had in this city, in weeks, that had felt entirely like itself. No performance beneath it. No angle she was tracking. Just two people looking at pictures and talking about what they saw. She filed that away too. The law firm's name had not meant anything to her when she first read the card. Marsh, Calloway, and Associates. She had read Calloway and thought of herself, her own last name, her mother's last name, the name she had grown up with, and had not yet understood that it was also another man's name. A name belonging to someone who had put it on a building and on a partnership, and on a founding document that she was only now weeks away from seeing for the first time. She spent the 2 days after the gala doing something she usually tried not to do, researching the world she was moving through. She had access to the internet. She knew how to look things up. She had been deliberately keeping herself at a certain distance from it, because she understood, instinctively, that knowledge in this situation was not neutral, that the more she knew, the more her choices would mean, and the more her choices meant, the harder it would be to maintain the kind of clean detachment she'd been relying on to get through the weeks. But the card was in her coat pocket, and she kept feeling it there. And on the second evening, she opened her laptop and typed Holt Industries Founding into the search bar and read. Franklin Calloway had been the second name on the founding charter. She found this in an archived Forbes profile from 2001, a long-form piece about the company's expansion into real estate development, which mentioned briefly that the company had been co-founded in 1987 by Edward Holt and Franklin Calloway, and that Calloway had died unexpectedly in 2014, his shares passing into a trust with no named beneficiary that had since been managed by the estate, a phrase the journalist had not pursued further, but which Nora read 3 times. A trust with no named beneficiary. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She searched for the Calloway name in the context of Savannah, Georgia, and found nothing. He had not been from there. He had been from New York. There was no connection to Savannah except through one person, and that person was her mother. She sat with that for a while. She did not call the number on the card that night, or the next. She waited, not because she was afraid, she told herself, but because she needed to come to it from a place of choice rather than impulse, and she needed to understand her own motivation before she picked up the phone. Was she looking for money? No. She had made decisions about money before, and they had all been based on what she needed to do her work and live her life. And that calculus was familiar to her, and she trusted it. Was she looking for a fight? No. She had no appetite for legal battles, and even less for the specific exhaustion of fighting powerful institutions with resources she did not have. Was she looking for something she could not name? It matters more than either of us knows. On the 4th night after the gala, she took the card out of her coat pocket and looked at it for a while. Then she put it in the drawer of the bedside table. Then she went to sleep. Then she woke at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark of an apartment that was not hers, in a city that was hers but not in any way that felt certain. and thought about what it meant to be descended from a person you never got to meet. Not the biographical facts of it, not the legal implications, but the strange, specific grief of it, the way it sat in the body as an absence with edges. She fell asleep just before 5, and in the morning she called the number on the card, and the woman on the other end said Gerald Marsh had been expecting to hear from her, and she made an appointment for 3 days later, and hung up, and felt the particular quiet of someone who has stopped standing at a door and begun to open it. What Diana did next was not what Nora had expected. She had expected resistance, the composed, methodical resistance of someone who had spent 40 years learning to hold a position. She had expected legal language, procedural delays, the board members exchanging glances while Diana found a way to reframe the declined document as a tactic rather than a genuine act. What she got instead was Diana reaching for the document with a hand that was not entirely steady. "I want to be clear," Diana said, and her voice had changed, still controlled, but carrying something underneath the control that had not been there yesterday. "That if this is a negotiating position, it will not." "It isn't," Nora said. "You understand what you're giving up." "I understand exactly what I'm giving up." She held Diana's gaze. $400 million in shares in a company I have no relationship with. In a legal battle I would likely win, but that would take years and cost both of us more than money. In pursuit of a relationship with a father I never knew, who is gone, and who cannot be recovered by any outcome in this room. She paused. "I'm giving up the idea that there's a financial resolution to a personal loss. That's not a difficult thing to give up once you see it clearly." Diana looked at her for a long moment. The board members were very still, the specific stillness of people in the presence of something they had not been briefed to expect. "The trust documents," Diana said slowly. "The ones Franklin filed in 2013. You've seen them." "Yes." "Then you know there's a secondary provision." She said it carefully. "Beyond the shares. A personal archive. Letters, photographs, records. Things he compiled over the years about your mother, about his own decisions, about why he made the agreement he made." She paused. "These are not contingent on the estate claim. They are yours by explicit direction, regardless of what you choose about the shares." Nora went still. "He wanted you to know him," Diana said, and for the first time in their entire acquaintance, she sounded tired rather than formidable. "He spent 12 years building an explanation for choices he made before you were old enough to be consulted on them. Whether you take the shares or not, the archive is yours. I should have told you that yesterday. Instead of—" She stopped, composed herself. "Instead of what I did yesterday." Nora looked at her hands, at the ring on her right hand, at the way the light moved across it. "I would like the archive," she said quietly. "I'll have it arranged." Diana looked at the document on the table, the signed disclaimer. 1 page, clean and complete. She did not pick it up again. "I will say one more thing, and then I will not say it again." Nora waited. "My brother Damien's father thought very highly of Franklin. They were friends, before they were partners, and they remained friends until the end. The company was never supposed to be about this. It was supposed to be about building something." She touched the edge of the document with one finger. "I have spent 20 years protecting what I thought was the building. I may have lost track of what the building was for. It was," Nora thought, "as close to a reckoning as a woman like Diana Holt was going to arrive at in a conference room on a Tuesday morning. And it was enough. More than enough." "For what it's worth," Nora said, "I think you built something worth protecting. I just think maybe you were protecting it from the wrong things." Diana looked at her with an expression that was almost a rueful smile. "Perhaps," she said. Nora stood. She buttoned her jacket. She looked around the room at the board members, at the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the Manhattan skyline beyond, at all that vertical ambition laid out under an October sky that had finally, after weeks, gone blue and clear. "Gentlemen," she said to the room generally, and walked to the door, and through it, and down the corridor toward the elevator. She and Damien stood on Fifth Avenue for a long time, longer than she had expected, either of them to stand still in a city that kept moving regardless. At some point he put his jacket around her shoulders, not with announcement, just the simple practical gesture of someone who notices that another person is cold and she let him, because she was cold, and because it was a gesture that came from below the strategy line, from the place where he was just a person standing next to another person on a sidewalk. "The archive?" she said. "Did you know about it?" "Yes." "From the beginning?" Yes. She absorbed this. That changes some things. I know. It doesn't change everything. I know that too. She looked out at the park, at the trees just beginning to turn, the first real color of the season starting to show at the edges. I was going to ask you something, she said, in the conference room yesterday. Before I walked out, I know what you were going to ask. Do you? You were going to ask whether any of it was real. He said it quietly, without inflection. Whether the things I said and did over the past 2 weeks had been managed or had been genuine. Whether there was a version of me that existed outside the calculation. She looked at him. And the honest answer, he said, is that I'm not entirely certain I know the line. Between who I am and how I move through the world, I've been doing one as the other for long enough that they've... He paused, searching for the word. Merged. I know that's not a satisfying answer. It's an honest one, she said. Yes. I'll take honesty, she said. Over most things. The light changed. A group of tourists moved around them, cameras raised toward the park. The city continued, indifferent and enormous, full of futures it had no opinion about. She reached up and took his jacket from her shoulders and held it out to him, and when he took it, their hands overlapped for a moment on the fabric, and neither of them moved away from that. Savannah, she said, I'm going to go for 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Take the time you need. I'll have my phone. He looked at her, and she saw the question in it, not the asking of it, because he was who he was, but the presence of it, the specific shape of a person who wants to know something and is deciding whether to let it show. She decided to let him off the hook. I'll text you, she said, when I get there. Something happened in his face. The precursor to a smile, yes, but also something quieter than that, the particular look of a person receiving a piece of information they'd been uncertain they'd get, and finding that they'd needed it more than they knew. All right, he said. She turned, walked toward the corner. The light was good, that October blue gold that only lasted a few weeks, the light that made the city look like it had been photographed by someone who loved it, and she thought about cameras, and Savannah, and her mother at 22 standing on a rooftop, looking at a skyline with someone off-frame, laughing. She thought about archives, about boxes of things kept carefully for someone who didn't know to look for them yet. She thought about what it meant to be found, even after the person who had been looking for you was gone. She crossed the street, and below her palm, warm and present, the ring was exactly where it had always been.